सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
How do we understand political economy? Now, obviously, politicians do. They may not be economists, but they understand politics and they know how to use economics in a way that they can win votes. Now, there are different ways. There are ways, for example, Narendra Modi now, Prime Minister, has now raised a question. He's talked about winning votes by distributing revdis. But there is a counter to that, that look, why is it revdis only when we distribute them? When you distribute them, they are something virtuous. They are like vitamin pills. So आपके नाम में हम बांटे तो रेवड़ी, आप बांटे तो vitamin pills. How does this work? Now there are arguments, counter arguments, but beneath all that is data. So let's look at data. So what happens when a government spends too much or invests too much in unproductive pursuits, or what the Prime Minister just called while inaugurating and laying the foundation stones of a bunch of very high profile, very important infrastructure projects in Maharashtra. He made this speech in Nagpur and I will share a full link of the speech with you. He said that, look, what happens when you have Amdani Athanni Kharcha Rupaya, which means you earn 50 paisa, you know, rupiah or rupee used to have 60 nanas earlier. So Athanni is 8 ana, that is half of a rupee, 50 paisa. If your income is 50 paisa and you spend a rupee, you can imagine what will happen, which means you will go bankrupt, you will borrow, etc., and all kinds of evil consequences will visit you. Good argument. How does one explain what is it that you define as Amdani Athanni Kharcha Rupaya in political governance or in political economy? That is the money you distribute to get votes. Now that is also something that the Prime Minister himself defined quite succinctly. He said that people use taxpayers' money and deposit it in their vote banks, so they can then withdraw it as votes. Good point. But is there any party that is not doing it? Is there only one party that's doing it? Because in some ways its target is Aam Aadmi Party, as has been the case for some time. But is there any party that isn't doing it? If you look at various parties, see the Congress now, they are offering old pension scheme in every state where they get elected or where they've been elected, right? They've done so in Chhattisgarh and Rajasthan, and they are now promising to do so in Himachal as well. All right, so AAP is bad, Congress is bad, they both distribute revdis. What about the BJP? So if you look at the data, I told you behind all these arguments is data. The beautiful thing about economics is that data is available. So if you look at data, look at what Modi government has been spending on subsidies. Now today, this morning in the Indian Express, Harish Damodran, who is a senior journalist who I think the world of, he's done a marvelous analysis of the subsidy bill under Modi government. And he shows you that this year Modi government is estimated to run up the second highest subsidy bill in India's history. The second highest subsidy bill. When was the highest? That was also under Mr. Modi's watch. That was 2020-21. This year is 2022-23. And what is the difference? 2021 was 7 lakh crores or 7 trillion rupees. This year already we are sort of tracking 5,32,000 crores. So 2014-15, subsidies as a percentage of India's GDP was 2%. Now, Modi government worked on it, and Modi government said that because they were distributing this money to get votes, and remember, he said that I consider Manrega to be a big evidence of the failure of the Indian state over 70 years of misgovernance. So he actually addressed subsidies, and subsidies came down as a percentage of India's GDP under his watch. So from 2% in 14-15, it came down to 1.8% in 15-16, and then next year 1.3% and 1.2%, then came down to 1%. Excellent. Now, partly because he was reducing the subsidies, mainly on fuel, on how fuel subsidies in India have come down, because he allowed gradually petrol and diesel to find their level in the market, and then kerosene as well, and also LPG. Subsidy then was confined only to below poverty line people, and that's how fuel subsidy bills had declined. So what was 2% of GDP in 2014-15 became 1% in 18-19, remained at 1% in 18-19, then went up in 2021, as you would expect because of the pandemic, 3.6. Today, it's again trending upwards of 2. So 8 years down the line, subsidies as a percentage of our GDP, and in this case much higher GDP, because GDP does grow every year, much higher GDP is still 2%. So Modi government has not achieved that objective of reducing subsidies as a percentage of our GDP. If anything, they are spending more money on subsidies than before. So once again, are these revdis or are these vitamin pills? You have to think about that. Because once again, if you look at the absolute figures, if subsidies were 2.49 lakh crores in 14-15, over the next 4-5 years, they've remained in the 2 lakh crore ballpark, right? They haven't gone up. Then suddenly they've gone up in 2021. That you can understand. And also to be fair to Modi government, there's a little twist there. Because the twist there is that not all of that money was distributed that year. What the previous governments were doing, and that's where Prime Minister Modi was correct, what the previous governments had been doing was they were getting their companies owned by them, whether they were oil marketing companies for whom oil bonds were raised, and those chickens will come home to roost. There was also FCI, Food Corporation of India, and fertilizer companies, which were giving subsidized grain and fertilizers to the farmer and the consumer. So, for example, if Food Corporation of India, and I'm giving you notional prices for ease of calculation. If Food Corporation of India bought wheat, say at 20 rupees a kilo, it would still cost it another 7, 8, maybe 10 rupees, maybe more in storing it, in procuring it, storing it, and transporting it. And then it was sold for 1 rupee under the Right to Food program. Similarly for paddy, similarly for rice, 2 rupees a kilo. Then rest of the gap, who was going to fund it? So government was to fund it, but because government didn't have the money and government did not want to take the burden on the budget, they let the company carry that burden. Now the company can't print money. Government can print money and government doesn't want to print money, but FCI can't print money. So what would FCI do? FCI borrowed. From where did it borrow? So Government of India diddled FCI because they owned FCI by making them underwrite this subsidy. FCI in turn made up for this deficit by borrowing. Borrowing from where? Borrowing from government sources. Borrowing essentially from national saving funds, from banks also, nationalized banks. That in turn stressed out nationalized banks because their loans were not being repaid. And that also brought in a certain risk on national saving schemes, because after all, the poorest Indians or the lower middle class Indians' money is saved there. That is in national saving certificates, post office saving banks, etc. So what Modi government did was in 2020-21, and that was one of the great things Nirmala Sitharaman did, as part of her pandemic package, she came up with a plan of Ganga Snan for these companies. So what did she do? She took a tanker full of Ganga Jal to FCI and fertilizer companies and sprayed it all over them. So that cleansed them of their sins. So a large amount of money was paid to these companies by way of their overdues. So in turn, they could pay back, say, government's own banks and national saving schemes. So this was basically circular trade or circular hera-fairy, sleight of hand within the government with taxpayer money. So with that money, in fact, 3,40,000 crores, that is 3.4 trillion crores of money was paid back, of debt was paid back to the National Savings Scheme. So that is why we can understand why it had gone up to that much in 2020-21. Then the government started the free grain distribution scheme. So 80 crore Indians started getting free food grain, 5 kilos per head, no questions asked, right? That consumed a lot of India's buffer stocks, etc. But India had a lot of grain. So that's been given and that added to the cost. On top of that, global crude prices started going up, and crude is the base material for fertilizers. So fertilizer prices rose globally, and with crude, other commodities also rose, phosphorus, potash, everything, and government subsidy bill also went up. So what happened in the process was that fertilizer and food subsidies kept on going up, and Modi government, which had acted very prudently on fuel subsidies post 14-15, did not equally do so on food and fertilizers. And that's why this year also we are looking at a subsidy bill of at least 5,32,000 crores. And how do we know that? We know that because in the first 6 months of this financial year, India has already run up a subsidy bill of almost 3,18,000 crores, 3.18 trillion rupees. And now on day one of Parliament, Modi government has also sought Parliament sanction or vote for another 2,14,580 crore. Added, it adds up to 5,32,000 crore. So that much of subsidy has already been budgeted for this year. Now, what is it that's gone up all this while? Food until 2019-20, food had remained in the 1 trillion rupee ballpark in spite of the Right to Food program that UPA had started, about 1 lakh crores per year. It shot up to 5,41,000 crores in 2020-21. One, because its free grain distribution scheme started, and second, as I told you, there was an extraordinary expense booked, which was by way of payouts to FCI and also to fertilizer companies. So it went up to 5,41,000 crores, but it's not coming down, at least not to older levels, because free food distribution, free grain distribution plan has continued. So it was 21-22, 2.89 lakh crores or 2.89 trillion. You know, we are beginning to use trillion. So at the moment, I also repeat in lakh crores. So we get used to this. So 2.89 trillion rupees. And this year, again, if you look at what's happening with food, we will go back, food subsidy will go back to the 2020-21 peak if you take out those extraordinary expenses for that year. Fertilizer is again going up. It was 71,000 crores in 14-15. By 2021, it had almost doubled to 1.28 lakh crores and then 1.54 lakh crores. This year, it looks like it will go up by 2/3 even on top of that. Now, there might be an explanation for that because crude prices have gone up. But the fact is that the promise of Modi government was to try and address these subsidies. The whole idea was you will modernize your fertilizer distribution, fertilizer usage. We'll become more prudent in our usage of nutrients, and that will also prevent destruction of our soil. But that has not happened. Our farmers are still addicted to nitrogenous fertilizers at very, very heavy subsidies, and that is causing multiple problems. But at this point, what is relevant to us right now, that the fertilizer subsidy is going up quite heavily. It's already cost us almost 54,000 crores this year. Another 1 lakh crore has now been sought by the government from Parliament. So fertilizer subsidy again this year will go up equal to our all-time high. That's about 1.55, 1.6 trillion rupees. What has come down under the Modi government, and that's quite creditable, is petroleum subsidy. So it was 60,000 crores in 14-15. It came down to almost nothing. It came down to 3.4 thousand crores last year. This year, it's trending towards 6,000, 7,000 crores. Maybe some is going towards LPG because global crude prices have gone up. But Modi government has figured that they can take for granted the votes of those who buy fuel and run vehicles, etc., etc. So that is a big gain. But whatever you've gained by way of curtailing fuel subsidies, you've now more than 5 times made up for by increasing subsidies for food and fertilizer. Now, is that revdi? Is that not revdi? Those are questions we need to ask, and that's why these debates are very important, and that's why it's very important for us to look at data. So what else did the Prime Minister say in that speech? He said, राजनीतिक स्वार्थ के लिए कुछ राजनेता, कुछ पॉलिटिशियन करदाता का पैसा उठा के वोट बैंक में डाल देते हैं. So I'm repeating to you what he said in Hindi. I will translate it. That look, what do some people do? They take shortcuts, use the word shortcuts. They take shortcuts, they take taxpayers' money and they deposit it in their vote bank. So basically, they can withdraw votes from that bank. And he said these are the biggest enemies of the taxpayer. And then he makes a very wise point. He says that look, for any country to grow, you should be able to plan predictably for the next 25 years. But if you're constantly running through this cycle of deficits and bankruptcy, how can you do that? And he gives the examples of South Korea, Singapore, the Gulf countries, that those countries did not have this kind of cynical politics, so they built infrastructure, and that is the difference. And he says, a few decades back, South Korea was also a country like ours, but South Korea then invested in infrastructure, fixed its politics, invested in infrastructure. Look at the Gulf. Why are they able to give jobs to so many lakhs and lakhs of Indians? Because they built their infrastructure. Similarly, says Singapore. A few decades back, Singapore was just another island that nobody wanted to go to. Now everybody wants to go to Singapore. Why? Because they got their politics right and they built their infrastructure. Because if only when you get your politics right that you can look at the future, you can do long-term planning. Then he goes on to say that we missed the first industrial revolution, which we obviously did because we were in a very bad place at that point. We had one empire declining, the Mughal Empire, and the other empire getting set up. So we in India were really caught on the wrong foot when the first industrial revolution came. These are my words, not his. Then he said second and third industrial revolutions also, we lagged behind. It's not as if we lost out completely as in the first one, but we lagged behind. Fourth one is on right now, and we cannot afford to miss out. And then he says, स्थायी विकास के मूल में infrastructure है, which means infrastructure makes the foundation of lasting development, of sustainable development. And that's why it's important for all politicians to put national interest above their political interest and not be afraid of losing votes. Because such an opportunity, he said, doesn't come often. India has such an opportunity. Stable development is the lasting solution to our problems, long-term solution to our problems, etc., etc., etc. And then he comes to his conclusion, which is the price we pay for amdani athanni, kharcha rupaya. And then he uses strong words. He says policies like this hollow a country from within, hollow an economy from within, which is what's been happening to India. Ye dishaheen hai, which means it's directionless. Ye kuniti hai, which means it's an evil policy. Swarth ke saath bani hai, which means it's a selfish, self-serving, evil policy. Now, what he's done is, you can agree with him, disagree with him. Obviously, if you are his voter or his supporter, you will agree with him. If you are not his voter and not his supporter, you will say, look who's talking. You are accusing others of taking away taxpayers' money to buy votes. What have you been doing? The biggest revdis are this free grain, because after all, every family that gets 5 kilos per head of free grain every month is also getting 5 kilos per head of grain at 1 rupee or 2 rupees a kilo also every month. So that's also nearly free. So if that is not revdi, then somebody giving 200 units of free power to the lower middle class or poor classes, how can you hold that against them and say that they are being cynical or self-serving or amdani ithanni kharcha rupaya, because you are also doing that. Now this is an eternal debate and this will continue, and that's what politics is all about. Politics is about debate, point, counterpoint. Those will continue. And what we do in Cut the Clutter is we give you arguments and counter arguments, but most importantly, we also give you facts underlying them. So the most important fact underlying all of this is your deficit. Amdani ithanni kharcha rupaya. That in terms of fiscal discipline or in terms of how your politics manages their economy or your political economy is defined by your fiscal deficit. So see, where did we started and where have we come to? So if the data point underlying all of this, right? What is prudent, what is not prudent, what is amdani ithanni kharcha rupaya, that is the fiscal deficit data. So when Modi government took over, when they succeeded UPA, they said that UPA had run up a large deficit and that was having all kinds of bad consequences like high inflation, high interest rates, etc., banks not having the money to lend. What was fiscal deficit at that point? Fiscal deficit at that point was 4.1% of India's GDP, which is very high. Anything over 3% is very unhealthy. 4.1% was high, and true to his promise, Narendra Modi tried to bring it down. So next year from 4.1%, it came to 3.9. You will see the chart. Then 3.5, 3.5, 3.4. Then suddenly, financial year 20, that is 1920, it went up to 4.7. That was high and bad. Why did that happen? You can't blame the pandemic for that. That happened, I'm afraid, because that was the election year. So that was the year to spend more money. Now, more money was distributed. Again, what is welfare for one side is revdis for the other. So if you were contesting against Mr. Modi in 2019 elections, you would say, "Arey, aap to revdi baant rahe ho," right? So in that year, fiscal deficit went up to 4.7%. That is well above the 4.1% where UPA had left India. Next year, it went to 9.2%, but that happened all over the world because that was the year when countries went into lockdown. India also had a big lockdown. So that's a South Khun Maaf situation. You can overlook that. The next year, all right, you would have expected better improvement, but it still came down to 6.7%. You would have expected the improvement to come faster, but still from 9.2 to 6.7 is an improvement. This year, only 6 months have gone. At least we have data for 6 months, but looks like we are trending towards deficit. That's anything between 5.3% to 6% of the GDP as the year ends. So once again, it's all a mixed picture. And once again, the reality is that every political party, every political leader who wants votes spends money on subsidies. And again, one side might say, my subsidies are virtuous, they are meritocratic. And the other side might say, your subsidies are all freebies and revdis. And that argument will continue. And I do hope the data we've shared you with our analysis helps you make up your minds in terms of what is prudent and what is not.